everybody. Can you hear me? If you can, wave. Are we all on and happy?
I can hear you guys. Good to see you. I'm going to be on mute the whole time. So, yeah.
Okay. Okay. Now, and here, so it's 5 o'clock, Lagos time. We're here today to have a chat with General Akintude Akinkunmi about the events of January 15th. We have a hybrid between me and the physical people we have here. Shout out people so that we know that we have some people here. And online, we have lots of people as well. So welcome, General.
Thank you very much, Aduke.
How's the volume?
Very good.
It's good. Okay, so for those of us who don't know, I'd like to tell you a little bit about General Akinkunmi. He's a doctor, a psychiatrist, in fact. He's a, okay, thank you. He was commissioned into the Nigerian Army for 3 years. Then when he moved to England, to work, he ended up in the British Army and retired there recently as Major General. And he's recently been installed as the OC Jagomolu Egba, which I understand is also a kind of a warrior title. Am I right, General?
Ballpark. No, it's not royal.
Okay, so welcome.
I don't have delusions of grandeur just yet.
Fabulous. So welcome. And today is January 16th. Yesterday was January 15th. And what we are here to discuss is how the events of January 15th, 1966, why do we think that's still important? Why do we think that it's something that's worth talking about? And I think, first of all, for people who are not familiar with the geography of Lagos, I'd like to say that where we are now, Onikan House, is a minute's walk away from what is now the ECOWAS Secretariat. And I'm sure you'll tell us what that building was in 1966. And it is about a 20-minute walk from here to the radio station, and maybe a 25-minute walk to Ikoyi Club golf course. It is also the PMT offices there as well. So I think this location in 1966, how would the people living in this house, would they have heard anything? What would they have seen? Oh yes, one more thing. Awolowo Road as well was a purely residential space. There was no Falmore Bridge. There, in fact, speaking of commercial, Bacchus, in fact, hadn't even opened. So Lagos looked completely different. The residents of that time in this space, that night of January, the night of January 15th, the morning, what would they have heard? Would they have heard anything?
Right, well, thank you very much. And before I deal with that, I just think it's important to say a thank you to Lovinglagos and to yourself for inviting me to speak on this subject. I think it is arguably the single most seminal event in the history of independent Nigeria. And I say that not just because of what happened that day, but also because of the second, third, and fourth order unintended consequences of that action. To pick, two of the most obvious ones was the so-called counter or revenge coup of July 1966, And both of those things, the January 15th and July 29th events, really then spilt us into a civil war. And I believe that Nigeria in 2022 is still suffering the lingering effects of those actions. So a pretty important date. In terms of your question, in terms of what would they have seen and what would they have heard, actually largely nothing, because I would have thought that the good people of Lagos in 1966 would be fast asleep in their beds when the events were unfolding around them. However, the ECOWAS Secretariat building to which you refer was, of course, then the residence of the Prime Minister of the Federation, Alhaji Sir Abubakar Tafawa Balewa. Next door to it, him, lived the Federal Minister of Finance, Chief Festus Okotie-Eboh. And both of them eventually became the casualties of the coup. There were also events relating to the coup that happened in or around the vicinity of the golf course that you referred to, which was where Brigadier Mai Malari met his end. And what was then Ikoyi Hotel, now Southern Sun Hotel, was also somewhere where events took place, because it was there that late Lieutenant Colonel Lovinglagos met his end. So yes, the events happened started in the late hours of the 14th, Friday the 14th. And it's quite uncanny actually how those dates actually fall on exactly the same days this year. So Friday was the 14th, Saturday was the 15th. And there were also events actually today, the Sunday the 16th, which was the meeting at the Cabinet Office, which is also not a million miles away from where you are, where General Ironsi took over the leadership of the country. In terms of proximity, I've mentioned the arrests of Balewa and Okotie-Eboh just down the road from you. I've mentioned the assassination of Lagema and Mai Malari, in other events. But I think that the events of this occasion took place in more than one location, and their shadows are still reaching very firmly into 2022.
Okay, so let's sort of, if we can, go back. So the first inklings were probably of the planning were probably like August 1965. Is that correct?
Well, the planning for this particular event, yes, according to the report of the special branch of the Nigerian police, which investigated the coup, and which was based largely on the interrogation of those who were arrested in connection with the coup, suggested that planning started about August of 1965. And I think it's also important to make one point here. I'm always very intrigued by how coups in Nigeria usually are associated with one name in particular. And more often than not, actually, the people whose names are associated with those coups actually weren't part of the original planning group at all. And that, the first coup, which is popularly known as the Nzogu coup, was actually initiated by three separate officers, Emmanuel Ifeadjuna, Ogbo Orji, and Donatus Okafor. And Nzogu, whose name is now associated with the coup, was a later, although completely willing recruit to the coup. And I suspect in his case, as in many cases with the other coups that I talk about, the coup is associated with his name because he made a radio broadcast. And that is what sticks in the memories of people. So, for example, another good example is the Orka coup. He wasn't involved in the planning of that, at least not initially, but he made the broadcast. Ditto the Dimka coup, but Dimka did it's just a side point. So yeah, that's the planning started in August. Those three officers, and then they slowly kind of pulled in people that they knew or suspected would be of like mind to them. So people like Nzogu, for example, they knew was somebody of like mind. And then there were others who were slowly pulled into it. So Christian Anuforo, and Humphrey Chukwuka, Adewale Ademoyiga, and so on and so forth. The coup itself kind of evolved in planning from those initial meetings in August. And there is really good anecdotal evidence, actually, that it occurred on the date that it did for two reasons. One was that the plotters did not wish to carry out the coup in the middle of the Commonwealth Prime Minister's Conference, which was actually holding in Lagos at the time and ended the day before. I think they probably regarded it as bad manners to be going around slaughtering the Prime Minister when he's hosting other Prime Ministers. And the other reason was that they had, and there's pretty good evidence of this from a number of independent sources, that they had received intelligence that the federal government was, as soon as the Commonwealth Conference was over, was going to flood the West, which was then very unsettled, which I'll come to in a moment, yeah, with troops, ostensibly to keep order, but actually in fact to prop up the tottering and very unpopular government of Akintola in the West. And so it was to preempt that latter occurrence that they struck when they did.
Okay, so you've mentioned the fact that it was to preempt the takeover, or rather the interventions in the events that were happening in the West. At that time, the West was completely on fire, wasn't it? It was,
yes.
And do you want to tell us a bit about why it was? It had started from elections, yes? And people weren't happy with the outcome of those elections.
Yes, that is correct. Before I do that, I think it's also important to point out one point. We've talked about this coup, the planning for this coup starting in August, but actually there had been rumors of coups dating as far back as December 1964 and January 1965, related, surprise, surprise, also to elections. In this case, the federal elections of December 1964, and the stories then, which I think one must take with a pinch of salt given subsequent events, was that Colonel Ojukwu had approached colonels, his fellow colonels, Gowon.
Banjo?
Yes, Gowon and Banjo sorry, I thought I'd lost you for a moment with the sound. To set up to displace the federal government in view of the shenanigans around the election, and to set up a tripartite, 3 colonels, 1 from the 3 regions kind of thing. The trouble with that is that those allegations first emerged at a time when things were really beginning to fracture. They were raised, in fact, by General Gowon in a newspaper interview when Nigeria, the civil war had started. And the problem with that was that by this time, of course, Gowon and Ojukwu were on both opposing sides of the civil war. And Ojukwu had actually executed the 3rd member of the triumvirate, Banjo. So, but there had been these stories, and those were driven by those elections. But coming back to the January 15 election, I think that it wasn't just one incident, I think, that kind of led to it. I think that it had been a series of things that had been happening for a while. And these go back probably even before that federal election that we're talking about. So there was the state of emergency that was declared in the same Western region in 1962 after the Western House of Assembly passed a motion of no confidence in the Premier, and there was fighting in the chamber, and the state of emergency was declared. Then there were also the deployment of the army on internal security operations. And it's very important to actually just highlight this point. Before the control of the Nigerian army passed to the Nigerian government in 1958, the army had been stood to, put on alert for deployment on internal security operations. So, for example, when there were riots in Kano in 1953, and then riots in Ibadan following the Adilabu's death in 1958, but they had never once been actually deployed until the political command and control passed to Nigerians, and that's when we started getting Nigerians troops deployed on internal security operations in Nigeria. So there were those in riots in the TV land in 1960 and in 1961, and again in 1964. I've talked about the federal elections in 1964, and then there were, of course, the Western elections in October 1965, which really was a byword for skullduggery and shenanigans on an immense scale. All sorts of tricks were employed. Opposition candidates would not be allowed to file their registration papers, and then their opponents would be declared elected unopposed. The results would be counted in one. Results would be counted in one place, and then something else announced somewhere else, and so on and so forth. So I think it was a steady drip, drip, drip. But I think that October 1965 thing was probably the straw that broke the camel's back. And why all of these things are important is because virtually every single one of the principal plotters of that January 1966 coup had seen at first hand the result of what was widely believed to be the ineptitude of the then civilian government of the First Republic. And it couldn't have escaped their notice that actually without the army, that government could not survive. And so I think that the combination of all those things kind of got us to where we were. If I were to pick up one reason why it happened, it would be a widely held discontent with the elected government of the day. I leave it to the audience to think whether this widely held discontent is repeating itself at the moment.
But I think something that is also, I think, interesting is that the army wasn't a very large army, was it, at that time?
No.
I'm sorry to interrupt, and I raise this point because I think it's not, because a lot of us watching are familiar with the army now, we don't really appreciate that. In fact, the army then was actually quite small. And in fact, you mentioned 1958. Up until that time, from the Second World War to 1958, it wasn't actually under control of Nigerians, was it?
No. It was part of West Africa Command of the British Army, and it was funded 100% by the British taxpayer.
Okay.
And never has been that old aphorism being so true: he who pays the piper dictates the tune. So the British Army controlled everything to do with appointments, recruitments, promotions, supplies, training, everything. And the Nigerian government had absolutely no say in any of that. And that's changed on the 1st of April, 58 as part of the transition plans towards independence.
And the fact that the British government had control, that also meant that even the entry of the Nigerians into the Nigerian army was also not on, shall we say, a level, even plane. The Nigerian recruits had to sort of jump through more hoops. Perhaps you'd like to talk about that?
Well, absolutely. I mean, when you look at what the earliest Nigerians who got commissions into what was then the Royal Nigerian Army had to go through compared to what their British equivalents had to go through, especially those who went to Sandhurst. It's like comparing chalk and cheese. The Nigerian potential officer had to pass all sorts of, it had to have a written examination, then a physical examination, then an interview at district, then an interview at army headquarters level. Then he would be sent to a recruits course in Teshi in Ghana. Then he would have to pass a regular commissions board to go to Mons or Eton Hall, and then pass another commissions board to go to Sandhurst. Whereas the British potential officer cadet who went to Sandhurst didn't have, the only thing they had to do was go pass regular commissions board, and off they went to Sandhurst. So what you found was that the initial Nigerian officers who were commissioned had jumped through so many hurdles. You couldn't escape two conclusions. One was that the British were in no hurry to produce Nigerian officers. And the second is that actually professionally, that initial crop of Nigerian army officers were incredibly well trained. And I think that is something that sadly got diluted, further down the line. But yes, that is quite true. In January, on the 14th of January 1966, before all of this happened, the Nigerian armed forces, not just the army, the armed forces was 10,500 men. My last post before I retired, I commanded more people than that.
And out of that, only about 200 were involved in the coup, right?
Yes, it was a very small thing, and I mean, I think we should, this is just a kind of like a health warning here, because it is, it's a very emotive subject. But if one just steps back for a moment, and I think it's probably easier for people who have spent 2/3 of their life in uniform, it's easier to do in these circumstances. What you ask yourself, what effect were they trying to achieve? They were trying to remove a government that they found completely discredited. Okay, and in order to do that, they had to ensure that those who were in a position to stop them achieving that effect had also to be neutralized. The sum total of everybody who took part in that coup was probably fewer than, in fact, it was fewer than 300. And so they were incredibly stretched ab initio. If you stop and think about it, just in Lagos, you mentioned some of them alone. You had to take over, the electricity exchange, the phone exchange. You had to kind of arrest various personalities. I can think of at least 6 or 7. Those people had to be guarded, all of that stuff. So they were kind of really stretched. And there's also very good evidence, and part of this actually comes from my interviewing 2 of the surviving plotters of that coup for a book that's forthcoming on, that I'm writing on the history of the Nigerian Civil War, because they subsequently went on to fight in the war, not just because of the coup, but there was pretty good first-hand evidence. The plotters themselves were divided as to how to deal with these people. And there were those who favored just kind of eliminating them ab initio. There were others who thought, no, we won't do that. We will arrest them. But if they resist arrest or try to escape, then all bets are off. And eventually it was left very, very unclear. Everybody was left to their own discretion as to what they did on the day. But there is one significant thing that I think needs to be pointed out here. If what you were trying to do is remove a government, then even if your coup fails, but you have eliminated all the members of that government, it stands to reason that that government cannot return in its original form. Sounds brutal, but I think that is a calculus that must have crossed at least some of their minds. I don't claim to speak for them, and I'm not in any way, shape, or form advocating coups. I'm viscerally opposed to any suggestion of the military being involved in government. But nonetheless, I think this is something that is often overlooked when people talk about what happened and why it happened the way it did.
Okay. You've mentioned the telephone exchange, but why didn't they disable it? That was key, surely.
Well, at least one of those individuals that I spoke to said that this was a question that they had plenty of time at leisure and Kirikiri to ask themselves.
Okay, so for the audience, let's explain what happened. What were the effects of them not having disconnected? So everybody has come to the party, right? May Malawi's party, and they've gone home and they're in Ifejuna's house in Lagos. In Kaduna, they're doing things. So let's talk about Lagos. What happens then? Everybody's at the party, they've had a good time, and the party is in Ikoyi. He's invited them, they're at the party, they've now gone home, they're there. What happens next, and why is the phone important?
Okay, well, in our focus on what happened in Lagos, because that's where this is largely directed at, although it was actually also relevant to some extent in what happened in Ibadan. So, there's a cocktail party at Brigadier Malari's house. Again, I'm sorry?
In Ikoyi, just for those who don't know where.
Yes, number 11 Thompson Avenue, to be precise. I have tried to locate that because the only clue that one has from literature and from those who were involved in it was that it's a corner plot, but I can't find a corner plot that's number 11. Anyway, that's an aside.
Okay. So that's a puzzle. Okay, let's go on.
So anyway, so there's this cocktail party, whether it was to celebrate my Malari's marrying his second wife, or whether it was to just have a Friday evening shindig, nobody knows, but they were all there. Then they returned to Apapa, which is where the 2nd Brigade headquarters was, and 2nd Brigade headquarters, which is where Ifeanyi lived, and most of those. And it was then that several officers who knew nothing about what had been planned heard about the coup for the first time. And so he says, look, guys, there were also others there who knew what had been going on. So the Ademoyegas and the Chukwukas and the Yanuforus and them. But there were many more, especially the younger officers, who had no idea. So he makes his pitch that, look, you know, the whole country is going to hell in a handbasket. We need to sort something out, da-di-da-di-da. And most of the officers agree to go along. There was one particular exception who asked if permission for him to go and consult his family as to whether he ought to be allowed to take part in this coup. And he was said, yeah, sure, go ahead. And as soon as he walked out of the room, somebody went after him, and that person saved his life. But actually saying, my friend, if you don't come back to this place, you are dying now. Anyway, so they all took part in this coup. Now, here was the problem. They found out they allocated targets. Some of those targets were in Ikeja, sorry, in Apapa. You know, so Kuru Muhammad and Chinyolu Nebe lived in Apapa, so they were pretty local. But then some of the other targets, the Prime Minister, Okotiebo, Mai Malari, and the biggest target of all, Ironsi, lived on the island. Okay. So they fan out to arrest these people. They get to Mai Malari's house. There's a bit of a scuffle because some of the guards kind of try and resist. Shots are fired. Mai Malari hears this and legs it through the boys' quarters and back onto the golf course. Now, they also go and arrest, you know, Colonel Pam, who also lives in Ikoyi. This is where the not severing the communications becomes vital, because Pam's wife picks up the phone and phones and says, look, some soldiers have just come to arrest my husband.
Who does she phone?
Sorry?
Who does she phone?
I think it was, I can't remember off the top of my head, but it was the wife of one of the other officers.
Okay.
So he's now alerted that something is going on. Meanwhile, Mai Malari is on the land trying to get back to the Dan barracks to rouse the federal guard to try and suppress the coup. Not knowing that the federal guard he's trying to rouse to his aid is actually knee-deep in the coup. In fact, their commander, Donatus Okafor, was one actually of the originators of the coup. So Ironsi gets to hear that something is going on here. Right. Now, none of that would have happened if they had disabled the telephone exchange. So all the other officers would have been sitting ducks because they would have been completely unaware of what was happening. Mm-hmm. Same thing happened in Ibadan when the troops shot. In fact, when they arrested Fani Kayode, who was the deputy premier, and then with Fani Kayode, they then went to go and get Akintola, but the phones were still working because the troops that had been posted, were just posted to occupy the telephone exchange, not to disable it. Okay. So of course, Mrs. Fani Kayode picks up the phone and phones Akintola that they've just come to take my husband. So Akintola is now prepared for what's coming. So there were many instances in those kind of situations where the failure, and it's a simple tenet of military operations. You know, the first thing you do is, or one of the principal things you want to do is you want to dislocate the command element from the troops. Mm-hmm. Okay, so sever their ability for the troops at the front line to pass information back up the chain and sever the ability of the chain of the top of the chain of command to ferry orders in the opposite direction. So in essence, everybody's running around like headless chickens. But once you allow information to flow, people get a picture of what's going on quickly and then can take effective steps to counter it, which is precisely what Ironsi did. My personal view, and I know it's not a popular view, but I think that for those who have taken the trouble to kind of examine these things properly, is that the single most important reason why that coup failed was because Ironsi was left alive. And there is overwhelming evidence, documentary, anecdotal from first-hand information. Ironsi was the #1 target. The trouble was that he was a bit of a lad. So when they went to find him at home, he wasn't there. He was off at a party somewhere. He had, I think, a well-deserved reputation for being a man of the bottle. So when they went to look for him, he wasn't there. They went off. By the time he came back home, that's when he got the phone call from Mrs. Spam saying they've come to arrest my husband, and so on and so forth. So, it was that failure to do that, which is why in all subsequent coups, what happens? The first place they take over is FRCN.
Indeed. And so let's go to a big question. 1966.
Yeah.
January. Was it an Igbo coup?
This is another thing that is an incredibly emotive question. My personal view is no, it wasn't.
And before you answer, can we just sort of go back a bit and explain how the recruitment process of the army at that time also led to the fact that the rank and file tended to be from the north, but the majority of the officers were from the east?
Well, I would rephrase it and say from the south rather than from the east. And within the south, the majority were from the east.
Okay.
I'll try and deal with that very briefly. Prior to the control of the army passing to the Nigerian government in April 1958, recruitment had been done entirely by the British according to British standards, the end. When the Nigerians took over in April 1958, about a year and a half later on, they instituted a quota system. The quota system initially applied just to the other ranks, so non-officers, so to use a colloquial Nigerian term, the recruits. And the quota was that 50% had to come from the north, 25% from the east, and 25% from the west, which, remember, at that time included the Midwest, because of course there was no Midwest region at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Now, on the face of it, you would say, and this was done on the basis of roughly the population allocation. That policy,
the earlier census.
Correct. That policy actually tended to discriminate against the North, because the proportion of the rank and file was actually something from the North, or something in the region of 65 or 70%. So by reducing it to 50, on the face of it, it would appear to be discriminating against the North. However, the West in particular, every year struggled to fill that quota. And those recruits that came from the West actually tended to come from the Midwest, which was part of the West.
Of the West.
And so what the West couldn't fill, the East that was oversubscribed and the North that was slightly disadvantaged by this would fill. So that's what it was designed to do, as far as the other ranks was concerned, was that it didn't really make that much of a difference. Where it really made a difference was when it came to the officers. Now, don't forget that there were very stringent educational qualifications that the British had left behind when they left, in terms of what you needed to do to be able to kind of apply to be a commissioned officer. And the basic standard which was all officers commissioned before 1958 met, was that you had to have 5 O-level credits. For those who are still old enough to remember what O-levels were, 5 O-level credits. When the Nigerians took over, about a year after they did the other ranks quota, they then changed it so that, first of all, they dropped it to 5 O-level passes, so they dropped the educational standard required. And then in 1961, they dropped it even further. So you could now apply to be an officer in the Nigerian Army if you had a teacher's grade 2 certificate or Royal Society of Arts grade 3 certificate, which were actually less. They did not carry the cachet of GCSE or O-level qualifications. And that was done in order to enable more northern candidates get into the army. But that in itself was not actually the real killer. The real killer came when the Nigerian government stopped sending its potential officers to the officers selection school in Teshi in Ghana, which is where West Africa Command had previously been based under the British, and established the Nigerian Military Training College, now known as NDA. Now they could prescribe the entry requirements, some of which I've just outlined to you. But what the real thing was that quota was now applied to officers. So now 50% of the officers had to come from the north, 25% from the east, 25% from the west. And that now tilted the balance completely. But they went one step further. That quota applied not just to the intake, it also applied to the final pass list.
Okay.
So irrespective of where you were in the order of merit, 50% of those passing out had to be Northerners. Whether or not they would have made it on merit grounds was now utterly irrelevant. And that thing first came into effect in October 1961. So beginning of 1962 was when the first intakes really benefited from that. And the real interesting thing is that I can think of 3 Nigerian military heads of state who benefited from that. In fact, 4 who benefited from that dropping of the standards. One of whom currently lives in a place called Aso Rock.
So back to the beginning of our conversation of this question, which is, so was this an Igbo coup? And,
yes.
And that is why I asked you to give the background of the coup, so that we can understand that were there enough in this? Okay, explain. Was it an Igbo coup?
All right. I will say I'll come to that in terms of the recruitment. But there's one other thing, because we've only talked about the coup in Lagos. We haven't. The coup happened also in Ibadan and Kaduna.
And why did it happen in Enugu? And why didn't it happen in Benin?
I will talk about that in a moment. Now, so the only place in Nigeria where the coup was absolutely successful was in the north. So Nzogu, achieved in essence all his aims. Took out the Sardauna, took out the Ademulegun, who was the brigade commander in the north, took out Shudende, who was commander of NMTC, and NMTC is what now became NDA. In fact, he was a chief instructor at NMTC, so he was actually having troops out on a training exercise, and that actually was the cover for the coup. Completely successful, which was why he was the only person who was able to make a broadcast. And he only made the broadcast when it became clear to him that his colleagues in the South were completely screwing this thing up. And they hadn't got Ironsi, he was the #1 target. yes, the prime minister wasn't available, but the biggest fish of all in military terms was still running around loose and therefore able to mobilize and muster resistance to the coup. And in the West, what was he? As I've said, yes, they killed Akintola, but they did really schoolboy errors like not disabling the telephone exchange meant that Akintola was forewarned, Lagos could be alerted, and so on and so forth. So that it all happened there. Now, Enugu in the east, the plotter, the member of one of the plotters who was supposed to be in charge of operations in the eastern region was a gentleman called Louis Chudi Soka, who was a major, and he was supposed to be in charge of operations in the east. Rather inconveniently, a vacancy arose at the Indian Staff College in December of 1965. And 2 days after Christmas, he received a signal saying, pack your bags, signal has the place has become available, off you go. So the plotters were all of a sudden left with nobody who was involved in the plot, who could take charge of events in Enugu. And it was too late to start trying to recruit somebody. So what they decided to do was that they would send somebody from Lagos once Lagos had been sorted out, their view being that Lagos would be the center of gravity as far as these events were concerned. And then they would send somebody there to go and
was still the capital of Nigeria at that time anyway.
Correct. So by the time somebody left from Lagos to go to Enugu, by the time they got to Enugu, the coup in Lagos had failed because Ironsi was now summoning, resistance to this. So a signal had been sent to the 1st Battalion in Enugu saying, disregard anybody who comes and tells you that something has happened and these are the orders. So the best that happened, the other complicating factor in Enugu on that day was that one of the prime ministers who had been at the Commonwealth Prime Ministers Conference that I was talking about, that had just finished the day before, Archbishop Macarius of Cyprus, was in Enugu with Okpara, having gone there after the conference finished. Slightly complicating factor because you really don't want to be creating an international diplomatic incident, even if you knew what you were doing, and the people on the ground really didn't know what they were doing. So it was, I think, in some ways, coincidence, bad luck, with Sokai being posted to go to the Staff College course and Macarius being present, neither of which the plotters foresaw. I think that was responsible for the lack of any coup activity in Enugu. And as far as Benin is concerned, the answer is actually pretty simple and straightforward. There weren't any troops in Benin at that point. There was no military post in Benin. The end. The first military post in Benin was established after the January coup, when a platoon was sent from the 4th Battalion in Ibadan to garrison Benin. But prior to that, there were no troops in Benin, so there could not have been.
Even though it was the capital of the Midwest at that time, there was no.
Don't forget that the Midwest became a region 2.5 minutes before. It hadn't been in existence long enough. It didn't have all the kind of government infrastructure that all the other regional capitals had. So it wasn't the kind of thing that we're all familiar with now as, first of all, capital of Midwest, and capital of Midwest State, and capital of Bendel State, and capital of Edo State. It's been a capital for a long time. At that point in time, it had been a capital for 2.5 seconds.
Okay, I'm going to ask the audience to start thinking about their questions, so that, and for those online, can you start to put them in the chat? So,
sorry, I haven't actually answered your question about whether it was an Igbo coup or not.
No, you have not. No, I'm just prepping the audience so that they can begin to be thinking about it. And I will let them know. I will mute that person. Hold on. Okay, and then can you unmute yourself?
Yes, I have unmuted myself.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Off you go.
Right. Okay. So, in January 1966, the bulk of the middle ranks of the armed forces were actually Easterners, not necessarily all Igbo, Easterners. And when I say the bulk, I'm talking about, you know, captains, majors, lieutenant colonels.
And if I may stop here, as a result of the recruitment process.
Correct. The recruitment process, because the quotas I'm talking about, the officers who had just come in as a result of those were very junior officers. So they hadn't actually had time to rise to the middle ranks that I'm talking about. So those middle ranks, over years, by a process of attrition, would have become less Igbo heavy or less Easterner heavy. But at this point in time, they still were. So by way of example, there were 32 substantive majors in the Nigerian army in January 1966. 23 of them were Easterners.
Okay.
If you add the majors and the lieutenant colonels together, 75% of them were Easterners.
Wow.
So if you just pause for a second and think about it, the young wet behind the officers, young wet behind the ears officers who had benefited from this thing were hardly in a position to be mounting coups. At the other end of the officer spectrum were the senior officers who had all been recruited to those exacting British standards that I was talking about, and one of which was, we don't just get involved in politics. So not only were they much more experienced militarily, they were also kind of very, they were steeped in the culture of non-involvement in politics. So by definition, if you were going to get any sort of explosion, it would have come from those middle ranks. And they were overwhelmingly Igbo. So just purely on the basis of random selection, you were always likely to get a preponderance of the officers coming from that part of Nigeria. That's the first point. The second point is this, that coup making is inherently a very risky business. It is not, unless you succeed, the old saying about treason doth not prosper, or if it prosper, none dare call it treason. If you get it wrong, it can be pretty terminal in terms of your health and safety and welfare. So you are not going to spread the net to people that you're not sure of, that you're not sure they're on the same page with you. You're not going to bring them into your confidence until you're absolutely certain that you guys are on the same page. And bear in mind what I said a few minutes ago about the meeting in Ifeajuna's house in Apapa on the night of the 14th. The fewer than a third of the officers present in that room knew about any plans for a coup. All the others heard about it that night for the first time.
Wow.
Okay. So it's
decide on the spot. Are you in or out?
Absolutely. And part of the reason for that is, you can't be going around. The more people you go around asking, you will follow us, sooner or later they will hear. It'll leak. So it's kept very tight and very, very close. So that's the second point. The third point, and I think there's an element here of subsequently wanting to give a dog a bad name and then hang it. Everybody forgets that there were officers and soldiers from every other part of Nigeria who took part in that coup. And I can think of at least two who subsequently went on to become military governors. One under Gowon and one subsequently to that, who were not Easterners at all. In fact, they were both Northerners. And there were, we've talked about Ademoyega before. So that it wasn't a pure Igbo coup. If you want to be split semantic hairs and say it was a largely Igbo coup, fine, so long as you're talking about the officers, because again, the vast bulk of the troops, the other ranks that took part in this coup, were not Easterners. So I think there's an element of, ex post facto wanting to kind of label the people from that part of the country, and the Igbos in particular, with this idea that, oh yes, it was an Igbo coup and it was all designed to perpetuate them in power and so on and so forth. And the last point I would make on that particular issue is that we've talked about the man whose name is most kind of often linked with this coup, Chukwuma Nzorgu. Man was born and brought up in Kaduna. He spoke Hausa much better than, in fact, he hardly spoke any Igbo, but he was fluent in Hausa, and he wasn't even an Easterner, if you were going to kind of be split those kind of linguistic hairs or ethnic hairs, because he was actually from what is now Delta State, Upper Nam to be precise, which was never part of the Eastern region. So, and then the last thing I would say about this is that if it was designed to be an Igbo coup, why is it that the #1 target for that coup, yes, he got away, was actually Ironsi himself? And why was it that the single most important person in suppressing that coup was Ironsi? I don't think it was driven by egocentric sentiments. And sorry, there is one more point, which is this, that on the 2nd of July, 1967, Chukwuma Nzorgu gave an interview to Tai Sholari, published in the Nigerian Tribune. And he said that their aim was to free Obafemi Awolowo from Calabar prison and install him as an interim prime minister. Now, I'm not sure why, if you think it is an Igbo coup, you'd all put your necks on the line in order to make a Yoruba man prime minister. And I have to say that that position has actually also been confirmed to me by 2 of the plotters who took part in that coup, who were in Kirikiri prison, including the pilot who had been deputed to go and fly Awolowo from Calabar back to Lagos. So I think for all those reasons, I don't buy the argument that it was an Igbo coup. Yes, it was principally led by Igbo officers, yes, but it also involved officers from other parts of Nigeria. It involved troops from other parts of Nigeria. The principal target was an Igbo man. And the other thing everybody forgets that, oh yes, the Igbo killed all the Northerners and the Westerners. Well, last time I looked, Chinyelu Negbe was not a Northern nor a Western like that. He's an Igbo man, and his fellow Igbo men shot him. So for a whole variety of reasons, I think that I would take some persuading, and I know it's slightly sad, but I've been kind of doing this stuff for 25, 30 years, and I have never found any persuasive evidence that would lead me to say that it was an Igbo coup.
But I think that just to sort of, as we come to the end of this part before we open it up, I think that it was such a bloody, tragic event that it still resonates. It's still the events of that night. Every time you hear them, they're still shocking. Just the fact that it changed completely the trajectory of this country. I'm not sure really, despite all the books, yours included, that we can ever really understand what really happened, because some of it just seems pure being in the wrong place at the wrong time. I mean, the fact that Ironsi was the GOC. What if Mai Malawi Ogundipe had been chosen instead? What would the events have been? I mean, there's so much that sort of it twists on just one man or one other man's personal views. I mean, what would you say, just to round up this section, because we have some questions online, and then I'm going to take from the audience.
Yeah, I think, this is what soldiers call the fog of war. Everybody understands that whilst if you fail to plan, you're planning to fail. We all understand that no plan, no matter how good it is, survives contact. As soon as the action starts, it all goes to, excuse my French, rat shit. And then what distinguishes the victor from the vanquished are those who are able to adapt and improvise and overcome. Now, applying that to this particular thing, yes, there are so many what ifs, so many what ifs. What if Balewa had stood his ground and refused to appoint Ironsi? What if he had accepted the recommendation of the outgoing GOC, General Robert, that actually he should have appointed Ugundipe? What if Ironsi had, instead of going to the party on the boat in Apapa, he had gone home and they had got him? What if they had disabled the communication lines? There's so many what ifs, and I don't think one can. You have to accept that those what ifs will always apply. The question is, how do you manage? How do you deal with them? I said at the beginning that I think this incident was the single most seminal event in the history of independent Nigeria, because it led directly to the July 29 counter coup. January and July led to the Civil War.
Yep.
The Civil War led to a complete tightening of the unitary grip of the center over the states in Nigeria. And that process has just got more and more and more in our faces. So Nigeria of 2022, you can trace a direct line between January 15th, 1966 and what we're dealing with today. The absence of true federalism, a tendency towards centralism, a militarization of our society. I mean, I don't know if I'm the only one who notices this when I'm in Lagos, but everywhere you go in Lagos, in Nigeria, somebody or the other is wearing a uniform. Civil defense, bank security guard. And the idea is that we have become attuned to thinking that the wearing of a uniform conveys authority. It's a nonsense. But and that is an everyday consequence that we all see, but nobody recognizes it.
Yes. Well, thank you, General.
Anyway, rant over.
I'm going to take questions now. I'm going to be partial and ask for questions from the audience first, and then I'll make a note of the questions online. Audience, any questions? I can't have given you the partiality and then you're not going to.
Okay, I have.
Okay. Can she be seen on the camera? Yeah, go on. Yep.
Happy New Year. This is our
Can you hear?
You're probably going to have to repeat it because it's a little muffled.
Okay, you have to take off your mask.
Okay, I said Happy New Year. This is our
Oh, hi. Hi, I want to have a Happy New Year to you too.
My question is regarding the quota system as you described it being applied in the country. The quota system, can you hear me?
Hello, General, can you hear her?
I'm really struggling, I'm afraid. Sorry.
You're going to have to come to the phone. Yeah.
Do you want to bring
the phone to her?
Sorry. Years of things going bang, bang, bang. My hearing isn't what it used to be.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you.
So my question is regarding the quota system as you described it being applied in the military. The quota system applied on entry was perhaps some form of affirmative action. Specifically, my question is regarding the quota system rather than merit applied on graduation. Have you come across countries where this particular criteria is applied to graduating students, where merit is put aside and some other criteria, such as ethnicity, is used to determine the cohort that graduates?
So if I got that right, you're asking whether I have come across situations where merit is disregarded when it comes to the final pass list or the graduation list. Is that the question? Sorry,
Yes, that is my question. That is
okay. Short answer is no. I think there is a place, whether you want to call it quota, whether you want to call it affirmative action. I think there is a place for that in offering everybody an opportunity to demonstrate that they are capable and competent. It is not, in my view, appropriate to use it as a criterion instead of capability and competence. So if I may, the example that springs most readily to mind is the 30-odd years I spent in the British Army. I did 2 tours of duty as a selector on the Army Officer Selection Board to determine who passed, or as they used to be called, the Regular Commissions Board, which all these people I was talking about had been through. And there were set criteria which everybody had to meet. Now, if there were things that required a little bit of latitude, so for example, for those for whom English was not their first language, the written tests were marked with some degree of latitude, but it was a narrow degree of latitude. But there was the opportunity for a little bit of a helping hand if you needed it. So for those, for example, who fell 1 or 2 marks below the line, it was permissible, if they did well in other aspects of their testing, to give them a little hand up. But they were passed as a risk pass. So it was alerting the people on the other end of the pipeline at Sandhurst that they may struggle, but this is the background that they've come from. And that's taken into account. So what it did was that it actually gave them the opportunity to get to Sandhurst, to demonstrate that they could hack it. Okay, I don't have a problem with that. But once they got to Sandhurst, it had absolutely no bearing on whether they passed or failed. There was no dropping of merit standards in terms of the final pass list. So if you were given the opportunity and you could step up and you could thrive, fully for you. If you couldn't, Tango Sierra, as we say. So no, short answer is no. There is, I don't know of any other, I don't in principle didn't have a problem with the entry quota. If there was, you have to kind of be realist and take into the geopolitics of Nigeria into account. Where I think it completely crossed the line was then applying that same quota system to the final pass list. Because what you then ended up was in deadwoods who were getting through the system at the expense of other people who are much more capable and competent. And we're still paying the price for that.
Okay, Jude, and then we'll go online.
Yeah, hi, my name is Jude. My question is as regards Iran's and couldn't they
Can you hear him?
Okay, sir. I don't know.
Hello.
Okay. Hi, my name is Jude. My question is as regards General Iran's and the civilian dispensation at that time. Wouldn't there have been a way for him to have put down that coup while still preserving the, when I say the successful planning of the civilian. Because I remember one for Yusuf acting president, would there have been a way for the Ronsi to have moved against the coup plotters, put down the insurrection, but still respected the civilian life of man, and it doesn't have continued? Because to me, it seemed to be like there was a coup that failed because he put down the coup, and then he now did his own coup and seized power and continued. Wouldn't there have just been a way, because we were talking about the CEOs trained by the British not to get involved in politics? I don't know if it was one of them. Wouldn't there have just been a way you would have intervened, still respected democracy, and just stepped back into violence? Thank you.
I'm speechless because you have just encapsulated what I have always thought, and that is why I made the point about one of the what ifs was that what if it had been somebody else who had been GOC on that day rather than Ironsi? Would they have taken advantage of the position of power they found themselves in sorry, there's somebody talking of.
Let me mute everybody. Okay, and then ask you to unmute yourself again.
All right, thank you. The question is absolutely spot on. What he should have done, quite rightly, was to suppress the mutiny, and he had in effect done so. The only thing that was outstanding was that Nzogu was still in command of the northern region. But that was only a matter of time. There were all these kind of fanciful ideas about they were going to march on the south and so on and so forth. Yes, there were plans developed for all of that, but there's no way in hell that that could have succeeded. Absolutely no way in hell. So what he should have done was to have said, right, I have put the mutiny down in Ibadan and in Lagos, and we've held it in Enugu, and nothing is happening in Benin. There's still a problem in the north, but I now need somebody, the head of government, a head of government, to give me legitimate orders as to how to proceed. I've done what I have done on my own initiative because I didn't have time to be asking anybody for permission, and there wasn't even anybody to ask anyway. But now that we've kind of quasi-stabilized the situation, I need somebody to move things forward. And in fact, if there's anything actually that I think lends itself to this enduring thing about it was an Igbo coup, was that the two principal people in this discussion, Ironsi and Nwafo Orizu.
Uh-oh. Hello, can you hear us? I don't know. Is it us or them? Hello?
Who was the most senior?
We lost you.
Did you?
Yeah. Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can now. Yes. No, you're frozen. Is it
right.
you?
Sorry about that.
Okay.
I'm not frozen.
We don't have to be here. Okay. Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So the MPC ministers had said, please nominate Bukazana Dipchirima as the acting prime minister, and then we'll crack on. The NCNC ministers, who were in coalition but were a minority member of the coalition, said, oh, no, we don't want him. We want one of ourselves. And they said, I think it was Kingston Badiwe or somebody they wanted. And the MPC ministers quite rightly said, are you out of your minds? Who's the principal partner in this coalition? And there was a collective failure, I think, of moral courage, both by Orizu and Ironsi. I mean, any general worth his salt, even if Orizu had come to you with this harebrained idea, that you wanted to appoint somebody. You should have said no, because I'm not going to be party to any kind of illegitimacy. But I think he was too clouded by this opportunity that suddenly offered himself to become a military head of state. And don't forget that this was occurring in the context. I think this was now the 4th military coup in and around West Africa within the last 3 months. There's one in Upper Volta. There had been one in Togo. I think there had been one in the Republic of Benin. So, it was just a shambles. But that's, back to the question, and that's what should have happened. He should not have agreed to, or kind of twisted Orizu's arm into saying, no, I can't deal with this unless you hand over power to me. The obvious rejoinder would be, so how have you been dealing with it up until now? Were you in power then?
Indeed. Okay. Thank you. And we'll go to okay. So can you see the questions, or would you like me to read them out?
There are questions here, but you're the person who's choosing the questions, so you tell me which ones you want me to answer.
So Tundelea, would the absence of real existential enemies threatening Nigeria militarily at the time be a potential reason why it was so easy to bin merits in officer recruitment when the control of the army passed to the Nigerian government from the British?
I don't think so. I think even if there had been somebody who was threatening to invade us, who knows, Niger Republic, Chad, Cameroon, with sticks and stones and catapults, the powers that be were much more focused on having control over the levers of power. You see, they understood that even in a democracy, and this had been kind of borne out by the events of the last few years. And I think it could not have escaped the notice of the Anuforos and so on, that these guys cannot survive, they can't survive along without us. So they may be a democracy, they may be our political masters, but actually, we are the rock upon which they rest. And I think the politicians had worked that out and thought the last thing we want is to be beholden to an army that we cannot control. And I think that was the single most important driving force. Anything else, I think they would have viewed with, okay, yes, we have heard, but we're going ahead anyway. So I don't think that was an issue.
Okay, so if we have a question on what was the definition of Easterners? And I think that is probably connected to how the country was divided geopolitically then. Perhaps you'd like to talk about that. Did it include South-South?
It included part of the South-South. So it would include rivers, Bayelsa, Akwa Ibom, Cross River states, then Anambra, Abia, Ebonyi, Imo. Have I missed one out? I think that's it. It would not have included Delta, which was then part of the Midwestern region, and prior to that was part of the Western region. But yeah, so in essence, the old southeastern states, river states, and cross rivers, and south and east central state, that was the eastern region.
Okay, and the absence of Zik, we haven't spoken about that, and there's a question. What if Zik had been around? Would things have been different? Is the fact that he wasn't around, did that make it seem more likely that, oops, gosh, how coincidental? Well,
I think we should also bear in mind.
And the question is, did he know about the coup?
Short answer is I don't know. But I will say this, that Zik, at the time of that December 64, January 65 federal election, had tried to assert what he regarded as his authority as the commander-in-chief of the armed forces to secure the backing of the army, the navy, the army and the navy and the police, because the air force was a glint in his parents' eyes at the time. to accept his orders in terms of his plans to set up some sort of caretaker government. The then GOC, General Welby Everard, of course, was a white Brit. The head of the Navy was Akinwale Wee, who was, of course, Nigerian, as was the Inspector General of Police, Louis Edet. They took advice from the Attorney General, and they politely told Zik that, sir, we love you dearly, but we're not taking your orders. We are not under your control, so get stuffed. Now, I suspect that he would have been an utter irrelevance if he had been around. In fact, the only thing that could possibly have happened to him was that he might have become collateral damage. Now, did that inform his absence from the country? I don't know. What we are told is that he had some sort of hospital treatment in London, actually. And then on the advice of his doctor, and at the expense of the Nigerian taxpayer, he went off on a cruise in the Caribbean to recuperate. Nice work if you can get it. But I don't think he would have been a relevant factor one way or the other. And in any case, you know, even if he had been around, who was he going to give orders to? Is it to the majors who had just shot the officers who told him to get stuffed in the first place? I don't think so.
And he had tried it before, hadn't he, with Welby Everard, and they had told him nothing for you here.
That's what I was just talking about. Yeah, that's so they said no, we're not playing that game with you. The other thing actually to bear in mind was that a large chunk actually of the army held Zik in some degree of contempt because he had apparently a fondness for acquiring new uniforms and medals to take the salute at ceremonial parades. And, you know, the real soldiers would look at him and think, you know, he apparently, every time a foreign ambassador who was posted to Nigeria came and presented their credentials to him as the president, there would be apparently a conversation on the side, and then if you could see your way clear to asking your government to get me another medal to add to my collection, that would be really, really good. And they just didn't hold him in very much respect at all. So if anything, he's been there, somebody might have thought, okay, so is that idiot that is like to wear a medal? Oh, yeah, come and see what being soldiers like, and that kind of thing. So I don't know. I think, nobody has ever disputed that he did have medical treatment. Nobody has ever said that that was not true. Whether the recuperation on the cruise in the Caribbean was because of that, or it was because of, you know, an opportunity to top life at somebody else's expense, I don't know.
Okay. Do we have any questions in the room? Yes. Okay. A question in the room.
Thank you very much, General. It was a fascinating historical.
Can you hear him?
Yes.
Can you hear me, sir? Yeah, at the beginning of the talk, you mentioned the book that you're working on. And you said what happened in 1966, in 1966, is still affecting us today. So I'd like to know more about the book. When are you planning to release it? And what is it that actually inspired the book?
I'd like to know more about I missed the last end of it.
Sorry, you mentioned that you're writing a book and that you've interviewed a number of people who took part in that coup.
Oh, yeah.
I wanted to find out, because you said what happened in 1966 still affecting us till today.
All right. Yeah.
What exactly was it that inspired the book? And when do you hope the book will be released?
Okay. I am writing a book on the Nigerian Civil War. And the reason I interviewed those people was because they fought in the war. So the interviews were principally about their experiences of fighting in the war, but I couldn't have them in front of me and not ask about the January 15 coup, for which, in fact, it was the only reason they actually fought in the war, because they were, when they were detained in Kirikiri, and then they were then dispersed to prisons around the country, and they ended up in what was then the Eastern region. And then Ojukwu released them from detention. They obviously couldn't come back to Nigeria because, of course, they were still regarded as coup plotters. And so they fought on the Biafran side, literally really out of not much of an option. And they weren't just Easterners, as it were. There were people from other parts of Nigeria as well. So yeah, so that was the interview. But the point about what happened then still affecting us is, I think, can really just be summed up in one word: centralism. You see, soldiers are used to a unified chain of command. You can't have a situation where, as a divisional commander, you have 3 brigade commanders and all of them just kind of go off and do their own thing, which in essence, to some degree, is what federalism is about. So every successive military government tried to run the country on the basis of a unified chain of command, because that's what they were used to. And so they slowly turned Nigeria from a proper federal republic prior to January 1966 to what it is today, which is, in essence, it is there is a big company headquarters in Abuja, and there are subsidiary branches dotted around the country called states, but have zero, or at least a demonstrated zero, freedom of independent thought and action, because they're all so dependent on the federal government. And it is that this is the single most important thing that I'm talking about. We're running a constitution at the moment, and I know I'm veering off the point, but it's another example. That constitution was the successor to 2 constitutions that were imposed upon us by military regimes. And I say this, I speak from some degree of experience of having, served, albeit briefly, within the Nigerian army at a time when we were running a military government. And it was, as a young subaltern, then it was crystal clear to me we could barely run the army, never mind trying to run a country. And I always was of the view, which is probably why I didn't last long in the Nigerian army, that give it back to the people. If they screw it up, let them fix it. But it's not our job. We're not politicians. We're not designed. We're not trained. We don't even, we're until recently, we self-select. The army is not for anybody. It requires a special degree of lunacy to want to go and kind of make your occupation something in which you could very easily get killed. So it's self-selected group of people, and I don't think those things are always entirely compatible with the the horse trading and the give and take that is the essence. Politics is the art of the possible. In the military, the mission is king. The end.
Okay, before we go to the online, because BC has raised the issue of books, and I was going to say it at the end, there's a book that General has written. There it is, you can see it, and it's called HUBRIS, A Brief Political History of the Nigerian Army. There you go. So everything we've discussed today, you can find in there. General, where is it available?
Well, thank you for the plug. Oh God, where is it available? I know it's available at, it's available on Amazon. In fact, I think the publisher of the book is actually on this webinar. In Nigeria, it's available at Roving Heights, Lagos.
And Lovinglagos.
I haven't finished yet. At Roving Heights in Lagos and in Abuja, it's available at Quintessence. It's available in Ibadan at the booksellers. And It is available at Lovinglagos.
Okay, a round of applause for Lovinglagos. Okay, good. Okay, so let's go back to the online audience where we have quite a lot of questions. Okay, from Ayo Onojide, my question is, what influence was likely, if any, beyond Britain or other foreign power on the events leading to any of the coups or advice provided by a foreign power?
Sorry, say that again.
Okay, what?
I'm trying to scroll down and find it. Sorry.
Okay, right. It's right at the bottom. My question is.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Okay, over to you.
Yes. What influence was likely, if any, of Britain or any other foreign power on the events leading to any of the coups, or advice provided by a foreign power? There is, the old aphorism that, there are never any permanent friends, only permanent interests. And at least until recently, every sort of sensible government runs its foreign policy on these lines. So the starting point is not necessarily what's the best thing for that country. The starting thing is what's in our best interest to happen in that country. Now, and this was borne out very starkly by, and I know we're veering off the coup again, but the stance of the British government when it came to the Nigerian Civil War. At the beginning, they wavered, and they were sitting on the fence and hemming and hawing. And what tipped the balance? There were two things that were really crucial. One was, obviously, the oil, which was all or mostly in the eastern region. But what really tipped the balance was when the Russians started getting involved on the Nigerian side. And all of a sudden, they came off the fence in fairly sharp order, having decided that we cannot allow the Russians to get a foothold in West Africa. Secondly, the French were also starting to kind of have a dalliance with Biafra, and Britain would rather disembowel its own children with a blunt sword than give up any space in British West Africa to the French. And third, there was a clear, I think, view that there's only one winner in this, and we're not going to be on the wrong side. So, what was in Nigeria's best? If what was in Britain's best interests coincided with what was in Nigeria's best interest, wonderful. If it didn't, Tango Sierra. Now, coming back to coups in particular, I think that there has been evidence that foreign intelligence services, and I'm talking largely here about the British, picked up wind of coups and have kind of flagged it up. They flagged it up to Balewa himself, and he dismissed it. They flagged the same thing up to Shehu Shagari, and he dismissed it. Now, why were those warnings made? Because the British saw that it was in their best interest for those two governments to continue the way that they were. Nobody will persuade me that the British regarded Buhari as an improvement over Shagari, nor did they regard Ironsi as an improvement over Balewa. So yes, they will pick it up and they will flag warnings. But if the question is, did they actively instigate coups? They've done it in other places, in Guyana being one example. But I don't think that they ever did that in Nigeria. They just kind of determined what the mood music was, whether it was in tune with their best interest, carrying with the status quo. If it's not in tune with our best interest, well, we better let him know that actually, these guys are going to come and kick you out. So get a grip, kind of thing.
Okay, and that leads us to a question from Tayo Aluko. Drawing the line from then to today with your insight, knowledge of the British Army and the Foreign Office in recent years, how much influence does Great Britain have on the affairs of the Nigerian Army, and how does that compare with the United States Army right now? I hope that as you are retired, you'll be able to speak freely.
You're tired, Abby, sorry. That's what to do, but I agree. Want to drive there. Yeah, at some point, when you're driving, you may not feel it as such. But for a time like this, you not start feeling it. Yes, and then you not start feeling, then you get to.
Okay. So, General, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, so
Okay,
Did you hear the question?
I heard the question, yes. Two things I would say in response to that. First is that retired I may be, but officers in the British Army are subject to military law for the rest of their lives. So it doesn't really make a difference whether you're retired or not. And secondly, is that I am still bound by the Official Secrets Act. That said, if you want to talk about, I mean, I can talk about things that are in the public domain. So in terms of soft power, an awful lot of training of Nigerian officers and men actually goes on in the UK. When I was at Staff College, I had Nigerian cadets as an instructor, not thingy, and also had Nigerian officers at the Royal College of Defence Studies. I can think of one fairly recent Chief of Naval Staff, subsequently Chief of the Defence Staff, who was at RCDS. Now, so there is still an element of soft power, because those kind of things are ways of, you influence is not necessarily by kind of teleguiding people. It's kind of making friends, it's making connections, it's having access, it's being able to kind of phone somebody and say, look, I've got a problem, that sort of thing. And it's easier to do that when you've kind of worked with and lived with somebody for a while. And all powers, exercise that sort of influence. In terms of the United States Army, and you're talking about its influence on the Nigerian Army right now, I really don't know what the answer to that question is. I mean, oh gosh, it's what, 32 years or something since I last served in the Nigerian Army, 33. I can say, however, that the current Chief of Defence Staff, we served together in the Brigade of Guards, but that's as far as I can go.
Okay, so we have, okay, what would you say that most officers and men in the military identify more with their ethnicity and to a certain extent religious affiliation than the sovereign? That's a question, that's an opinion from Shani Adio. What do you think about that?
30 years ago, 30 plus years ago.
Okay, and just before you answer, please, I'd like to set that against a question from Femi Adebajo. Both Nziogo and Ademoiga stated that in 1966, the army was the only truly national institution. Was this correct, given the well-known ethnic animosities in the army, disquiet about recruitment quotas, ethnic balancing? So I think those two questions go together.
Yeah, I think that the ethnicity in the Nigerian army was not an issue to any significant degree until the first coup. Prior to that, the sense I get was that they viewed themselves as a band of brothers. And the mutual suspicions started on the 15th of January and just kind of got worse thereafter. So I don't know that it was an issue then. However, since that coup, and I was coming on to 30 plus years ago, yeah, you would hear things grumbling that, the CEO sent so and so on this particular course because he's his townsman. That you heard that kind of thing pretty frequently. But I don't have up-to-date knowledge of how that, you can't get the pulse of an army from a distance. You have to kind of live in the barracks, interact with the troops, interact with their families in the money markets and so on and so forth to really get a true feel of what the pulse is. I don't think the army has been immune, just like any part of society. I don't think it's been immune from the fragmentation of Nigerian society along those lines, along ethnic lines, along religion and faith lines. I don't think it's immune to that. And where it's likely to be a real problem is when you start getting people being elevated, not on merit, and this thing keeps cropping up again, but on where they're from and who they know. And that was one of the key things actually that caused the explosion of the Awka coup in 1990. So it's a very dangerous game to play, and I don't know enough about what's going on in the Nigerian army today on a day-to-day basis to be able to comment effectively. But I do believe that prior to January 15th, I think that both Nzogwu and Ademuke were actually largely correct about it being a band of brothers, and all the recruitment quotas, ethnic balance, and I don't think had actually got a sufficient grip to become a problem. It certainly did further down the line, so that by the time we got to the years I'm talking about, the same people who had obtained those kind of free passes, as it were, in terms of recruitment. It's not a coincidence, I think, that they were the second lieutenants and lieutenants of July 66, and then the majors and lieutenant colonels of July 75, and the brigadiers of December 83. So it's a gift, if you want to call it that keeps giving. Unfortunately, giving the wrong fruit.
Okay. Anybody physically? Any last questions? No, I'm asking. Anybody? No? So online we have a question on recruitment, which I think you might just want to go over again since you've mentioned it. How was the recruitment? The 50%, the 25%, how was that done? And then what the last question we'll take is from Babatunde Akintude, which is on, hang on, sorry. Has the role of the armed forces irreversibly changed since the 15th of January 1966? And how does the institution become more professional?
Can I deal with that first? Because I think it's a very important question. The central theme of HUBRIS, and sorry if I sound like I'm making a plug, but I think it's the best way to answer your question. It's that the idea was to interrogate the impact of the army's intrusion in politics on the army and on the nation. And I think the inevitable conclusion is that neither the army nor the country has benefited from that association. I think Nigeria as a country is vastly worse off, much more worse off than it would have been if the army had not intruded itself into politics that early morning in Saturday of 15th January 1966. And I think actually that the army itself would be so much better off if it hadn't got itself bogged down in things that it didn't know about in politics. I mean, just one simple example, coming back to the question about the professionalism. If we stop and think about the attrition and the wastage of officers that we spend thousands of naira and pounds and euros and dollars training, but we get rid of them because somebody from their town who is their sister-in-law's brother was involved in a coup. So anybody who's remotely tainted with him, all go. You change your service chiefs. Anybody who was his senior or his coursemate can't serve under him. all gone. That nonsense only started as a result of the army's intrusion into politics. And I would, you know, it's wherever you go, wherever you turn, this idea, you know, in 1962, 1963, 1964, for those who were alive at the time, I defy you to find me an example where soldiers were brutalizing civilians on the street on a regular basis. It didn't happen. It is the corruption of power, the absolute corruption of absolute power, which is what happens in a military government where you rule by decree, created that sense of, you know, impunity that bedevils Nigeria to this very day. I've made a point about the subtle militarization of Nigerian society, Nigerian Security and Civil Defense Corps. What the hell is that? And they all wander around with weapons in uniforms, some more gaudy than others. It's a nonsense. So Nigeria is infinitely worse off. The army is infinitely worse off as a result of that association. And to get the Nigerian military back to being professional, I really hoped, I really thought, I really prayed that the advent of a return to civilian rule in 1999. Notice I didn't say democracy. Advent of return to civilian rule in 1999. And that very courageous, I mean, I don't agree with Jagmulu on very many things, but that decision to remove from the armed forces any officer above the rank of major who had held a political position was actually what has sustained our civilian rule till now, because otherwise somebody would have overthrown it. But nonetheless, it is, we still, going back to, I mean, I really hoped that a new generation of officers who hadn't been tainted by involvement with military rule would take the army in among the army, I would say, I mean, armed forces in general. You know, when Alexander Ogomudia became the first Nigerian army officer to become a 4-star general without ever having held a political post, I thought, right, we're getting there. I think I celebrated too soon. It's going, and I think part of the fault lies with the, you know, fish rots from the head. If you have sound, proper political leadership of integrity, then I think your military will shape up, because they understand that they can't get away with behaving just anyhow, all this brutalizing troops on the street. If you had a civilian president who, after the 5th episode of army soldiers brutalizing civilians on the street, retired the chief of army staff, he would pretty quickly put a stop to that nonsense.
Thank you, General. If you can just quickly round up the issue of how the recruitment was, and then I'm going to thank everybody. And this is your last chance for questions online and in person.
I would like to find out, General being a Yoruba man, I think you said it was very hard to.
Can you hear?
It's not great, sorry.
You need to come.
Well, you said it was very difficult to fill the quota for the Yoruba quota system.
Oh yes, yeah.
I'd like to find out, being a Yoruba man yourself, why do you think Yoruba people are afraid to join the force?
Well, there was a very common perception that, you know, the armed forces and the army in particular were for wastrels and dropouts, and it wasn't somewhere where somebody from a good background and with any interest in bettering himself in life would want to serve. So I think there was I would be so bold as to call it out, you know, some sort of snobbish attitudes you know, my apologies to the non-Yoruba speakers, but you know, the speakers, but you know, you know, a child that is well born doesn't join the military. For Yorubas in particular, we have this really curious delusion that the only way forward is if we are all doctors and lawyers and engineers. And where that idiocy comes from, I don't know. Because if you stop and think about it, if you really stop and think about it, what are the pillars upon the institutional pillars upon which any society rests? Any society. First of all, the civil service. Which of us did our parents say you must go and join the civil service? The armed forces, the press. None of us looked at, none of us saying, you know, and you know, if my mother was still able to kind of hold a sensible conversation, I'd be saying, what the hell were all of you thinking about? You know, it was you want to go and join the army here, you know, and you start fasting and prayer and family meeting over your head. It's a way of thinking we need to get away from. And I think it's a very short-sighted view, you know, because we were the first people who came in contact with, at least the South, not just Yorubas, you know, Western education and all of that. We've kind of almost been indoctrinated into thinking that until we are, you know, the white man Mark II and doctors and lawyers and engineers, we have completely failed in life. Okay.
Okay, and I think we have come to the end. I'm just going to go up and see if I've missed any questions. Are there serious plans to get the military back to the barracks? How can we?
Technically, they've been back in the barracks, haven't they, since 1999? Okay. Except, and again, you see, again, sorry, I just make this last point. We say we have civilian rule. We think that, you know, we've had 4 elected presidents. 2 of them were not only soldiers, but also previous military presidents. You had a military man sitting as the president of the Senate for 8 years or 12 years or whatever, however long it was that David Mark spent there.
General, I'd like to thank you. I'd like to thank everybody online. I'd like to thank everybody physically. Can we give General a round of applause?
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
So any last words? Okay, there's one last comment. Are we going to have a part 2 of this conversation? If yes, can we please discuss July 29th, 1966, which to my mind was, by way of carnage, one of the events that inexorably decimated. And I believe that there's another yes from somebody. Hey, maybe if we have enough requests, what do you think, General?
Those decisions are made by people far above my pay grade.
So we're just going to ask people to just beg Lovinglagos and myself, and we'll think about it, right? So what do you think? So, okay, look, here we are. Okay, you see, people online are begging, so, you know, hey, let's see. We shall take an executive decision, and we'll let you know in July. How about that, people? Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a million.
And General, thank you very much. A last round.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Don't go yet, General, because we're going to take a photo.
You're going to take a what?
A photo.
Good.
We need in the background.
No, wait, you just stay there. You just stay there. That one?
You?
Yeah. We'll take with all of you here, and Lawon, you come and stand here.
You want to scare little children or something?
Okay. But you have to make sure that you get him on the screen. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, General.
All right. Thank you all. Thank you very much. Thank you all.
But in the meantime,